Welcome back to this week's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio, the weekly radio news magazine we put together here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy. Welcome back to the program from Liberty Nation Legal Affairs editor Scott Cosenza. Scott, welcome back to the program. How are you doing today, sir?
Well, I'm in lockdown, same as you, Joe, but other than that, I can't complain, I suppose.
Well, hopefully a Mother's Day weekend is good for you and your family, however you manage to do it, and we've all shown remarkable creativity in all this. Now, Scott, you've been following, as so many of us around the Commonwealth have, this ruling, this case of the gun range, the Lynchburg gun range, shut down by the governor's edict, but then a judge ruling, if I understand it correctly, that the Second Amendment overrules any governor's authority there. So catch us up. I understand the governor's now saying, well, maybe we'll go back on the 15th and maybe we'll start relaxing. But, to me, a statement like the Second Amendment trumps, pun intended, the governor is fairly concrete, fairly easy to understand.
Well, it is fairly easy to understand the notion that you cannot just close gun ranges because you have a pen, like the governor decided he would. However, there is some nuance in the order, and that's one of the reasons why it didn't apply to every gun range in the state, Joe. Judge Patrick Yates is the Virginia judge who issued this ruling, and he did totally brush back Governor Northam's idea or notion that he was sort of dictatorial with his power and just could do what he pleased. And Yates asserted that the Second Amendment rights of Virginians must be respected. However, the ranges themselves may have to be able to comply with certain health aspects and social distancing and so forth. And Judge Yates said, as a matter of fact, that the safe side range was willing to go ahead and do this, that, and the other thing to comport with the social distancing requirements. They have airflow management in that range that further decreases the likelihood that the virus could spread. And so this was a narrow ruling, but it did assert and bolster our Second Amendment rights.
Is this going to be one of those, decade from now, we look back at this case and perhaps others like it in other states, where we realize for the first time, and I've talked to so many listeners who had no idea the kind of British common law authority that the governor still maintains 400 years later over the ability to order businesses opened or closed or, pull their permits to operate, why we even had a bill, I think it was about 5 years ago, that gave farmers permission to sell the produce they grew on their farm at their farm. And I looked at the law and I stared at it for a while to make sure I wasn't misreading it. And then I talked to the author. He goes, yeah, that's kind of just one of those things. Virginia has to give you permission to do pretty much anything. And this could be a substantive moment of change in that in Virginia.
Well, I hope that you're right, not just in Virginia, but in the country. We did seem to be moving towards a system where all behavior was either mandated or forbidden. And the room for freedom then is narrower and narrower. Historically, though, we have to remember how the country came together, and it's that the states were sovereign and then formed the federal government. And so those sovereigns had the power to do so many things. And our Bill of Rights was originally a restriction of power against the federal government and did not apply to the states because the states could do things that would violate the Bill of Rights. It wasn't until incorporation of the Bill of Rights against the states came into play that we see sort of the dialing back of the ability for governors and state legislators to exercise significant power over our lives and impacting those fundamental rights.
Ironically, though, it's still a restriction on federal government authority, and it doesn't seem to be used as that because the federal government's gotten very creative in funding streams. We'll give you a bag of money, and you just ignore the Bill of Rights and whatever authorities we might have
right.
over these things. But, Scott, the The 14th Amendment that says, you listen, if it's against the rules in the Bill of Rights, ironically, this was something Patrick Henry fought long and hard to get, was the Bill of Rights that eventually wound up tripping up Virginia governor's ability to, enforce the mass resistance when they shut all the schools down, which didn't happen again until about a month ago, when the governor ordered all of Virginia's public schools to close. Is it an important lesson in constitutionality to say that they can't just rule this way, or are we dangerously teetering on a place where, in this misplaced belief that the government is going to keep us safe from things like crime and viruses, that we're going to cede our constitutional authority over the government to the government in some fraudulent pursuit of being kept safe?
Well, why don't you ask me a simpler question, like about abortion, Joe? This is,
but I mean, it's existentially, really, that's where we are.
I listened to the governor's press conference on Monday afternoon, and he talked about how it was his job to keep us safe, and he didn't talk about keeping us free or at liberty. Which I think that perhaps the famous Virginians who helped found this country, whether it's take your pick, Jefferson or Mason or Madison, would have appreciated the governor of Virginia saying, rather than safety, which I don't see how the governor can deliver in his capacity at all.
Well, and sadly, and on a tangent, I'm just going to stick a pin in this because it's really not our wheelhouse here. Scott Cosenza is on with us from Liberty Nation, legal editor there, and I want to get back into talking about the legalities of closing businesses and specifically gun ranges, churches, things that are constitutionally protected. That the premise, I guess, we allow still the governor to say, and I never heard the governor say, I'm sending the state troopers out to start arresting people. I'm not calling up the National Guard to start enforcing stay-at-home orders. He would just stop short of it. And it was really, he managed to get the press to report that he was ordering people to stay home. And I was told by an insider that he was doing it specifically to make the language such that we would qualify for federal disaster money, but not actually be a state troopers on every corner arresting you if you leave your house kind of thing. I think that's a real shade of gray, don't you?
Not only is it a shade of gray, I think that this whole notion that we have in the country of these orders is going to be a lawyer's full employment act going forward, Joe. The lost incomes and the restriction on liberty. The suits will come fast and furious, even more so when things start to open up. And we're going to see this stuff litigated through the courts. Unfortunately, it's a trailing indicator, right? So it's going to be months, if not years, before it's all resolved. And meanwhile, the liberty will have already been infringed on, and so many of the businesses will be closed and shuttered by then.
Well, and it's also been used as a cudgel to create this fear culture where I've talked to business owners who, after Monday's announcement, told me, well, I can't open on the 15th. I can't convince most of my key employees to come back to work yet. So we've done such an eloquent job of scaring the bejibbers out of everybody to say, okay, it's time to go back to work, everybody. You got a lot of people saying, I still got a few weeks left on the $600 bonus check.
It's hard to imagine that people won't respond to incentives. We know that they do in every area of life, so that they're incentivized to stay home with payments that keep coming. Who wouldn't, right?
There's a discussion about the next aid package, Scott, that will carry a liability protection for businesses. And as a rule, I tend to flinch about liability protections for businesses because I think eventually they outlive their usefulness. When a business is given blanket immunity from lawsuits, they tend to, after a period of time, start taking for granted the customer's safety that they're supposed to be thinking of in the first place. Or do we need something like that? As the legal editor at Liberty Nation, should we have an immunity protection for businesses that reopen?
It's a total catch-22. I wish I could have a good answer for you, but I think you're exactly right, which is that if it's granted, you can expect to see it likely abused in the future. But the other thing is, if a business goes to their attorney today and says, may I reopen, and what steps do I need to take to be in compliance with the law and not get sued later on? Really, an attorney has to say to them, I don't know the answer, because this is, again, backward looking.
Mm-hmm.
Courts will say that they have to do something they have to treat people reasonably. Well, what's reasonable in the face of this pandemic? If you're a small business owner, how do you know? It seems like they are in a catch-22 where they can't behave reasonably, yet at the same time, grants of immunity will no doubt give immunity to people who have behaved unacceptably.
Mm-hmm. Scott Cosenza is on with us. He is the legal affairs editor at Liberty Nation. You read his stuff online at libertynation.com. He's got a great piece on the Virginia gun range case out of Lynchburg that's in a gray area, and we'll see how it plays out. On an expanded theme, though, we talk about churches. We talk about right to assembly. The debate had been brought to me that telling a church you can't open isn't the same as Congress enacting a law establishing a state religion. So we may slide the protection for faith out, but the right to assemble, the right to petition the government for a redress of grievances has been severely diminished by these Zoom meetings that the local governments have all been partaking in. At what point is the Bill of Rights going to come back into play? We hear, then you start to get down into privacy issues and what can you know about my health care and what can you know about my health condition out of the abundance of security, because I feel like there's cases that could be made that the Bill of Rights is actually going to make us more likely to get sick, and I can hear the progressive attorneys making the case now that we need emergency powers to suspend the Bill of Rights because XYZ virus is going to cause grave harm to us if we don't know everyone's medical history and if we don't have the right to look at your computers and we don't have a right to track your cell phones and those kind of things.
Joe, they're always trying to come after our liberty, and this is one of the times when we have to be most on guard to protect it. I think that we will need, however, a specific and constitutionally passed amendment to somehow create an exception to the Bill of Rights if they want to go in that direction. Because right now, as I read it and as our courts have interpreted it, our Bill of Rights do give us that level of protection. And absent some wild-eyed reading of the law, which could happen from I hate to say it, a progressive judge, perhaps in the Ninth Circuit, but absent that, I think we do and will get protection. And it just happens to be something that it takes a while for the cases to be filed and then the protection to come down without vigorous protection from the executive themselves, which we certainly don't have in the Commonwealth of Virginia.
Right, and that's one of the things that I think is going to be case law going forward. I've talked to gun shop owners who have said that they have been selling guns more so now than even when the General Assembly went into session and started trying to pass all the gun grab legislation. And to people who are very sheepishly admitting, I never wanted to own a gun. I never, and of course they're not asking them their political affiliations, but by their confessions, they sound like Democrats who have all of a sudden said, hey, maybe I need to look out for myself. Has Ralph Northam and his political allies overplayed this grab against the Constitution and pushing some of their more centrist party members away in, saying, hold on a second here, I want my right to assemble. I want my right to bear arms even if I don't use it. I want my privacy, and it could be a political loser for them?
Well, gee, I hope so. I think that the tolerance for that kind of management is definitely abated given the crisis. And there's another point, Joe, that you make, which is that so many of these gun owners, we have now new gun owners that are arming themselves in response to the crisis and the lack of regular law enforcement activity, and also releasing of felons to make rooms in the jails and the prisons. And here's the other thing. They need a place to learn how to shoot. So many of these people and we've reported on LibertyNation.com about so many of them being first-time gun owners. They need a place to train and learn how to shoot. And a range like Safeside Lynchburg or any of the other ranges in the Commonwealth are ideally suited for them to responsibly learn how to use a firearm, something that the governor says he wishes people who own guns would do, to use them responsibly.
Right.
So that's another reason to require, and I'll say this is part of a fundamental right, and it's one thing that Judge Yates focused on, is that, and this is something that goes to the worship question as well, by the way. It's, the right to get a haircut is one thing, but the right to worship and congregate for worship or to exercise your Second Amendment rights, which are also Virginia constitutional guaranteed rights as well, is a different order.
You mentioned legislative changes. We've seen so often progressives, though, Scott, as a legal affairs editor, the progressives don't like to legislate these things. They want to get their judicial allies, the activist judge that doesn't want to get yelled at a cocktail party, to say that, well, Obamacare isn't constitutional per se. So I changed a word in it, and it's okay now. Is there a great danger that we see judicial activism take the place of legislation in these sort of things?
There is always that danger. And that's why it's important that we are on top of who gets to be a judge, because it's important that they follow our notions historically of what it means to have delineated rights and duties by the government, and not a sort of what I think we know as a living constitution sort of attitude where anything that sort of flows at the moment to quote unquote keep people safe, for instance, would fly.
Yeah, the interpretive dance that I think that really scared Patrick Henry in the day when, ironically, as one person pointed out, the governor's 2 p.m. press conferences come from a building that bears the name from the guy who said, "Give me liberty or give me death." And yet now, because of the fear of death, we're giving up our liberties. I don't think we are. I always worry, and just as a pretext, that the progressive lawyers seem to have a better grasp of this stuff going forward than the conservative ones do, who are usually gobsmacked by some great attempt at infringing our liberties, or saying that, well, bullets aren't actually part of a firearm, bullets aren't protected by the Second Amendment, which is also coming. Pennsylvania is attempting that, and I could certainly.
Well, let me interrupt and say that I think that you can count on the lawyers to be more greedy than they are politically motivated, and so it'll be about the dollars rather than the politics for most of the litigation, I think, that goes forward after the crisis. So business closures that were forced, for instance, and having those people sue the state for a violation of the granted authority, those types of cases, I mean, they'll be clogging the courts, Joe. I think it's a safe prediction to say that that's an understatement going forward.
So I guess we can count our blessings that for 3 years President Trump has been appointing judges, so at least we have some bulwark.
No comment.
Hey, Scott, thank you so much for your time and your coverage, and I don't think it's the last one of these that we're going to be talking about. He's online at LibertyNation.com. Read his VA gun range win piece. We'll see what happens over the next few weeks. But it always seems like they go 5 yards. We push back 3, but they all say, well, we're still ahead 2 yards. So we'll see what happens when the dust settles. You have a wonderful remainder of the Mother's Day weekend, and thanks for joining us.
You keep pushing, Joe. Thank you.
Absolutely. And for Dolly Madison and Martha Jefferson and Martha Washington and all the founding mothers, have a wonderful Mother's Day weekend from all of us here from the Taylors on down at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy. For all of us, so long, and thanks for all the fish.